The Sicily Campaign in the summer of 1943 was never supposed to look the way it did by August. On paper, the Allied invasion had succeeded. Amphibious landings were complete, swanning teams from ports were opening, and Axis forces were retreating toward Messina. Yet beneath that surface, the campaign was grinding down the men fighting it and straining the commanders responsible for keeping it together. This was not a clean victory. The invasion that began in July had forced American and British forces into difficult terrain almost immediately. Sicily's interior was hot, mountainous, and poorly suited for rapid movement. Roads were narrow and easily blocked, communications were unreliable, and supply columns struggled to keep pace with advancing units. German and Italian forces fought delaying actions that rarely aimed to defeat Allied units outright, but instead focused on slowing them, inflicting casualties, and forcing repeated redeployments. By August, the campaign had turned into a sustained pressure cooker. American units were advancing, but they were doing so in a series of exhausting fights rather than sweeping maneuvers. Progress came at a cost measured in fatigue as much as casualties. Men slept in short bursts, often under fire, and medical stations filled with soldiers suffering not just from wounds, but from heat exhaustion, dehydration, and psychological collapse. This environment mattered because it shaped everything that followed. The U.S. 7th Army was commanded by George S. Patton, a general who believed deeply in offensive momentum and personal discipline. Patton had taken over command in North Africa earlier that year. After the disaster at Kasserine Pass exposed serious weaknesses in American leadership and training. His job in Sicily was not only to defeat the enemy, but to rebuild confidence in an army that had recently learned how fragile it could be. Patton did that by imposing control. Under his command, standards tightened sharply. Uniform discipline was enforced even near the front. Orders were issued clearly and followed strictly. Units that moved aggressively were praised and supported. Units that hesitated were corrected immediately. Patton believed discipline under pressure saved lives because disorder led to hesitation, and hesitation invited disaster. That belief shaped his view of combat exhaustion. In 1943, the U.S. Army did not yet fully understand what would later be recognized as combat fatigue or battle exhaustion. Psychological collapse under sustained stress was often misinterpreted as cowardice or lack of discipline. Medical doctrine lagged behind experience, and many commanders believed that removing psychological casualties from the line weakened fighting strength rather than preserving it. Patton shared many of these assumptions. To him, the battlefield demanded endurance, and endurance was something soldiers were expected to provide unless physically wounded. He respected courage under fire and despised anything that looked like evasion of duty. In the abstract, this made sense to a commander responsible for thousands of lives and an ongoing campaign. In practice, it created a blind spot that would soon become critical. By early August, 7th Army medical facilities were under severe strain. Field hospitals near the front treated a constant stream of wounded men, while others arrived with no visible injuries at all. Some shook uncontrollably, others were disoriented, unable to speak clearly, or incapable of returning to their units. Doctors labeled these cases battle fatigue or psychoneurosis, terms that lacked the authority of physical wounds in the eyes of many combat commanders. The hospitals themselves were chaotic places. Staff worked continuously, often short-handed, treating men fresh from combat while preparing others for evacuation. Tents were crowded, noise carried from nearby fighting. The line between front and rear was thin. Officers and enlisted men alike moved through these spaces under stress, sometimes without full awareness of the medical assessments being made. When Patton visited these hospitals personally, he did so as part of his command routine. Believing that senior officers should see the condition of their troops and ensure standards were being maintained even behind the lines. To Patton, a hospital near the front was still part of the combat zone, and behavior there mattered just as much as behavior under fire. This was not unusual for him. Throughout his career, Patton believed that leadership required visibility. He inspected units constantly, spoke to soldiers directly, and used personal presence as a tool to enforce discipline. In Sicily, those inspections continued even as the campaign dragged on and tempers shortened. By August 1943, pressure was mounting on every level. German forces were executing an organized withdrawal toward Messina and denying the Allies a decisive encirclement. American and British units raced along separate axes, sometimes competing for objectives, sometimes coordinating poorly. Commanders worried about missing opportunities while also fearing unnecessary losses. The heat was relentless, and fatigue accumulated faster than replacements could arrive. Patton felt that pressure acutely. He believed 7th Army could still achieve decisive results if it maintained aggression and cohesion. Every delay frustrated him. Every sign of slackening discipline confirmed his fear that the Army might lose momentum at the wrong moment. In his mind, Sicily was not finished yet, and complacency was dangerous. This mindset set the stage for the incident. Patton did not enter the hospital tents looking for confrontation. He entered them, expecting to see wounded soldiers recovering and preparing to return to duty when possible. What he encountered instead were men suffering from conditions he did not fully accept as legitimate reasons for removal from combat. That disconnect mattered. The slapping incidents did not occur in isolation from the campaign. They were not random outbursts detached from context. They were the result of a collision between an army still learning how to understand psychological injury and a commander whose model of discipline left little room for it. The war had not yet taught its hardest lessons. In later years, combat fatigue would be recognized, studied, and treated as a serious condition. In 1943, it occupied an uncertain space between medicine and morale. Commanders like Patton operated with incomplete information, unshaped by older assumptions about endurance and courage. This does not excuse what happened, but it explains why it happened here, at this moment, in the middle of a campaign defined by pressure, exhaustion, and frustration. The field hospitals of Sicily were where the limits of Patton's command philosophy collided with the limits of human endurance. The incident that followed would not just affect one general's career. It would reshape Allied command decisions, alter the course of Patton's role in the war, and quietly influence how the U.S. Army handled combat exhaustion going forward, before France, before the Third Army, before Patton became indispensable. It began in Sicily, inside a hospital tent, at a moment when the war exposed a fault line that no amount of discipline could erase. August 1943 placed the 7th Army at a delicate moment in the Sicily Campaign. German forces were pulling back methodically, denying the Allies a clean encirclement, while American units pressed forward under mounting fatigue. Into this environment stepped George S. Patton, moving through the rear areas with the same intensity he brought to the front. One of those stops was a field hospital near the combat zone. The hospital was not a quiet refuge. It sat close enough to the fighting that artillery could be heard, and the flow of wounded never fully stopped. Doctors and medics worked continuously, triaging physical injuries while also trying to manage soldiers who showed no visible wounds but could no longer function in combat. The medical staff understood these cases as battle fatigue, even if the terminology and authority around the diagnosis were still unsettled. Patton entered the tent expecting order. His inspections were usually brief and direct, designed to reinforce discipline rather than invite discussion. In his mind, a hospital near the front was still part of the fighting system, and he believed soldiers there should present themselves as men recovering from wounds, not as men seeking escape from duty. Inside the tent, he encountered a private who had been admitted for what doctors described as combat exhaustion. The soldier showed no obvious physical injury. He was disoriented, shaken, and unable to return to his unit. To the medical staff, this condition was real and required removal from combat. To Patton, it looked like something else entirely. The exchange escalated quickly. Patton questioned the soldier sharply, asking why he was there and why he was not with his unit. The answers did not satisfy him. In his view, the soldier appeared frightened rather than wounded, and fear was something Patton believed had to be confronted, not accommodated. His voice rose, and the atmosphere in the tent tightened immediately. Then Patton struck him. The slap was sudden, delivered in front of doctors, nurses, and other wounded men. Patton shouted that the soldier was a coward and ordered him sent back to the front. The medical staff was stunned. The soldier was shaken. The tent fell silent in a way that had nothing to do with discipline. This was not the end of it. Days later, at a different field hospital, Patton encountered another soldier suffering from battle fatigue. The circumstances were similar, and so was Patton's reaction. Once again, harsh words were exchanged, and once again Patton struck the soldier in front of witnesses. What might have remained a single incident now became a pattern. Word spread quickly. Doctors and nurses discussed what they had seen, not as rumor, but as fact. Medical officers were particularly disturbed because the incidents undercut their authority and challenged their professional judgment. These were not disciplinary problems being handled quietly. They were public confrontations inside medical facilities. Reports moved up the chain of command. Medical officers filed formal complaints describing exactly what had happened and naming witnesses. These reports did not accuse Patton of losing control in battle. They described a senior commander physically assaulting soldiers under medical care, in violation of Army regulations and basic standards of conduct. The response from higher command was immediate, if not public. Senior Allied leaders understood the implications. Patton was one of the most aggressive and capable commanders available, but his behavior now posed a serious problem. The incidents risked undermining morale, alienating medical staff, and creating political fallout at home if they became widely known. The issue was no longer Patton's temper, it was trust. A commander who struck wounded soldiers, regardless of his intentions, threatened the legitimacy of the system he commanded. The U.S. Army could not afford to appear indifferent to the welfare of its own men, especially in a war where public support mattered deeply. Patton himself did not deny what he had done. When confronted, he defended his actions as necessary to maintain discipline and prevent the spread of fear. From his perspective, allowing soldiers to leave combat for psychological reasons risked weakening entire units. He believed he had acted in the Army's best interest, even if the method was harsh. That belief would not save him. Allied leadership now faced a difficult decision. Removing Patton permanently would deprive the war effort of one of its most effective commanders. Ignoring the incidents would signal that such behavior was acceptable. The solution they chose attempted to split the difference. Patton would be punished, but quietly. He was ordered to apologize to the soldiers involved and to the medical staff who witnessed the incidents. More importantly, he was removed from frontline command. While others advanced into Italy and later prepared for France, Patton was sidelined, his future uncertain. The consequences were immediate. For the remainder of the Sicily Campaign, Patton's role was reduced. His visibility dropped. His influence faded. To outside observers, he seemed to vanish from the war's center of gravity at precisely the moment when momentum mattered most. The slaps themselves took seconds. Their impact would last far longer. What had begun as a clash between outdated assumptions and emerging medical understanding now threatened to end a career. The general who demanded absolute control had lost it at the worst possible place, in front of witnesses, in a space meant for care rather than discipline. The war moved on without him. And in that absence, the Allied leaders were forced to ask a question that would shape everything that followed: whether a commander this dangerous, this effective, and this flawed could ever be trusted again with an army in motion. The decision to sideline Patton was made quickly, but it was executed quietly. There were no public announcements, no dramatic removals, and no formal court-martial. Instead, the response unfolded through private orders, closed-door conversations, and deliberate absence. The goal was not to destroy a commander. It was to neutralize a problem without igniting another one. At the center of that decision stood George S. Patton, still in Sicily, still technically in command, but suddenly without a future he could see. Senior Allied leaders understood the risk on both sides. Patton's behavior inside the hospitals was indefensible, especially in front of medical staff and wounded soldiers. At the same time, his operational value was undeniable. He was aggressive, decisive, and unusually effective at restoring momentum in broken situations. Removing him permanently would solve one problem while creating another. The compromise was containment. Patton was ordered to apologize, first to the soldiers he had struck, then to the doctors and nurses who witnessed the incidents. These apologies were not optional. They were formal, witnessed, and reported. For a man who built his authority on certainty and command presence, the requirement to apologize publicly was a deep humiliation. He complied. Those apologies mattered more than they appeared to on the surface. They signaled that Patton's authority was no longer absolute, and that higher command had stepped in to draw a boundary he could not cross again. Discipline now applied to the disciplinarian. The second measure was more consequential. Patton was removed from any role that placed him in direct command of troops in combat. While other commanders advanced through Italy and prepared for the next phases of the war, Patton remained behind the scenes. He retained rank. He retained title. What he lost was relevance. To the outside world, very little changed. Newspapers did not report his removal. Official communiques avoided mention of the incidents entirely. Patton simply stopped appearing at the front. His name faded from dispatches. For a commander who thrived on visibility and momentum, this silence was devastating. Inside Allied headquarters, the message was clear. Patton was being watched. His future would depend not on past success, but on whether he could demonstrate restraint, obedience, and reliability under political pressure. Or this was a different test than any he had faced before. The sidelining carried practical consequences as well. During this period, Allied deception planners recognized Patton's reputation as a potential asset, even while his command authority remained frozen. German intelligence viewed him as the most dangerous American general, the one most likely to lead an invasion. That perception created an unusual role for Patton, visible enough to be noticed, inactive enough to be controlled. So Patton was kept busy, but not in the way he wanted. He attended briefings, inspected units away from combat, and participated in planning exercises that went nowhere. His presence was used deliberately to mislead the enemy, even as he was denied the chance to shape real operations. In effect, he became a symbol rather than a commander. For Patton, this was unbearable. He had built his identity around action, movement, and command. Being reduced to a figurehead cut directly against his instincts. Letters from this period reveal frustration, anger, and a growing fear that his career had already ended, not with a decisive failure on the battlefield, but with a moment of lost control inside a hospital tent. What made this silence more painful was its contrast with events elsewhere. Allied forces were advancing in Italy, fighting hard battles against prepared German defenses. Opportunities were being missed and seized without him. Decisions were being made that Patton believed he could influence, if only he were allowed back into the fight. Instead, he watched from the margins. Allied leadership used this period deliberately. They wanted to see whether Patton could endure restraint the same way he demanded endurance from others. They wanted to know whether his discipline extended beyond the battlefield, into the realm of politics, optics, and institutional control. A general who could not accept limits could not be trusted with an army in motion. Patton adjusted slowly and imperfectly. He followed orders. He kept his public behavior under control. He avoided further incidents. He learned, painfully, that effectiveness alone was not enough in a coalition war fought under constant political scrutiny. Control had to exist, not only over troops, but over oneself. The irony was sharp. The same qualities that made Patton dangerous in the hospital tents: impatience with weakness, intolerance for delay, absolute certainty in his own judgment, and were the qualities that would later make him indispensable when the war demanded speed and risk. For now, those qualities were liabilities. By the end of 1943, Patton's position remained unresolved. He was not forgiven, but he was not discarded. He was present but inactive, known but sidelined. His future depended entirely on whether Allied leadership believed the incident in Sicily had revealed a permanent flaw or a correctable failure under extreme pressure. The war would soon force that decision. The coming invasion of France required a commander capable of exploiting chaos without creating it, a leader aggressive enough to move fast, but controlled enough to stay within political bounds. Whether Patton could be that man was still an open question. For months he waited. And in that waiting, the general who built his reputation on speed learned the most difficult lesson of his career: that control mattered as much as momentum, and that losing it, even once, could nearly end everything. Patton's removal from frontline command did not end with apologies and silence. The consequences followed him quietly, shaping decisions long after the immediate anger faded. Inside Allied headquarters, the slapping incidents became a reference point, a reminder of what could happen when operational brilliance collided with loss of control. Trust had been damaged. Senior commanders now viewed Patton through a narrower lens. His aggression was still valued, but it was no longer taken at face value. Every assignment, every appearance, and every recommendation involving him was filtered through the memory of Sicily. He was not dismissed as unreliable, but he was no longer assumed safe. That distinction mattered. In coalition warfare, perception carried weight equal to results. Allied leaders had to consider not only how a general fought, but how his actions would be interpreted by soldiers, medical staff, political leaders, and the public back home. The hospital incidents had shown how quickly a single moment could undermine confidence across all of those layers. Patton understood this more clearly than he admitted. During the months that followed, his behavior became tightly controlled. Public appearances were measured. Inspections were formal. The fiery language that once defined his presence was restrained in official settings. The general who had built his authority on intensity learned how fragile that authority could be when it crossed an invisible line. This change did not come easily. Patton believed deeply that discipline saved lives, and the events in Sicily did not immediately alter that belief. What changed was his understanding of consequence, and he learned that intention mattered less than outcome, and that even actions taken in the name of order could destroy the system they were meant to protect. Meanwhile, the army itself began to change. Medical officers pushed for clearer recognition of combat exhaustion, arguing that psychological collapse under sustained fire was neither cowardice nor malingering. The Sicily incidents gave weight to those arguments. Quietly, doctrine began to shift, not overnight but steadily. Treatment protocols evolved, and commanders received clearer guidance on how to handle psychological casualties. Patton's actions had forced the issue into the open. Ironically, this placed him on the wrong side of a transition already underway. The army he would later command in France was not the same army that had landed in Sicily. it was better trained, more experienced, and more aware of the limits of human endurance. The institution had adapted, partly in response to mistakes like his. For Patton, this created a paradox. The qualities that had nearly ended his career were still present, but now constrained by a sharper awareness of boundaries. He did not abandon his belief in toughness. He refined it. Discipline, in his mind, still mattered, but it now had to coexist with systems that protected the fighting strength rather than punishing its failure. Allied leadership watched closely. They needed commanders capable of moving fast once the invasion of France began. Speed would demand risk, improvisation, and tolerance for disorder. Patton remained unmatched in that regard. The question was whether he could apply those traits without repeating the kind of lapse that Sicily had exposed. The answer would not come in words. It would come in opportunity. As planning for the invasion of France intensified, Patton's name returned to conversations that mattered. Not publicly, not decisively, but cautiously. He was still sidelined, but he was no longer forgotten. His reputation with the enemy remained formidable, and that alone gave him value. Germany still feared Patton. That fear created a strange situation. A general considered too dangerous to command troops openly became useful precisely because the enemy believed he would. Allied planners recognized this contradiction and exploited it, placing Patton in visible but controlled roles that reinforced German expectations without granting him real authority. Patton played along. He followed orders, endured the humiliation, and waited. The man who thrived on momentum learned patience, not because it suited him, but because he had no choice. This waiting period did not soften him. It sharpened him. By early 1944, the consequences of Sicily had settled into something more stable. Patton had not been forgiven, but he had been contained. He had not been restored, but he had not been discarded. The army had learned from the incident, and so had he. Both were preparing, consciously or not, for a moment when speed would again matter more than caution. That moment was approaching. When the invasion of France finally came, Allied leadership would need a commander capable of exploiting chaos without creating scandal, someone aggressive enough to move faster than the enemy, yet disciplined enough to remain inside the lines Sicily had revealed. Whether Patton could meet that standard would soon be tested. The slapping incident had nearly ended his career. What followed would determine whether it had merely delayed it or reshaped it into something more controlled, more dangerous, and far more decisive than before. By late 1943, Allied leadership faced a problem they could not solve cleanly. The slapping incidents in Sicily had crossed a line that could not be ignored. Yet the idea of permanently removing George S. Patton created a different kind of risk. The war was not forgiving enough to discard effectiveness lightly. Patton remained a liability, but he was also an asset no one else could fully replace. From a disciplinary standpoint, the case against him was clear. He had struck soldiers under medical care, challenged the authority of army doctors, and embarrassed the command structure at a time when cohesion mattered deeply. Firing him would have sent a powerful signal about standards and accountability, especially to medical personnel and enlisted men. From a strategic standpoint, firing him made little sense. The Allied army still struggled with speed, initiative, and aggressive exploitation. North Africa had revealed those weaknesses painfully, and Sicily had not fully erased them. Patton, for all his flaws, was one of the few American commanders who consistently pushed units to move faster than doctrine, habit, or comfort allowed. That mattered more than appearances. Senior commanders, including Eisenhower, understood something uncomfortable. Patton was dangerous, but so was stagnation. Removing him permanently would eliminate a problem of discipline, but it would also remove a commander uniquely suited to moments when the war demanded risk rather than caution. The solution was neither forgiveness nor exile. Instead, Allied leadership chose containment paired with observation. Patton would remain in uniform, retain rank, and continue to serve, but under tight control. His behavior would be monitored. His opportunities would be limited. His future would depend entirely on restraint. This approach served multiple purposes at once. Publicly, it avoided scandal. Quiet punishment prevented the incidents from becoming a rallying point for criticism at home or among Allied partners. Internally, it sent a message to the officer corps that no one was immune to consequences, even a general with Patton's record. Privately, it preserved options. If the war evolved in a way that demanded speed and audacity, Patton could be brought back. If he failed again, his removal would be final and justified. The slapping incidents became a test case rather than a verdict. Patton understood the stakes. He did not argue publicly. He did not challenge the decision. He complied because defiance would have confirmed every fear Allied leadership held about him. Silence became his survival strategy. During this period, Patton's reputation with the enemy continued to work in his favor. German intelligence still viewed him as the most aggressive American general, the one most likely to lead any major offensive. That belief gave Patton strategic value even without command authority. Allied planners recognized this and incorporated him into deception efforts, allowing his presence to mislead German expectations. This was not redemption. It was utility. Patton's name and image were being used, even as his hands were tied. For a commander obsessed with action, this was punishment of a different kind. He remained visible enough to matter, but powerless enough to frustrate. The Army's decision not to fire him was not an endorsement. It was a calculation made under wartime pressure. Discipline mattered, but winning mattered more. Allied leaders believed they could manage Patton's flaws while exploiting his strengths, provided they controlled when and how he was unleashed. That belief would soon be tested. Planning for the invasion of France was accelerating, and the coming operation would hinge on exploitation once a foothold was secured. The Allies did not yet know who would be best suited for that role, but they knew what kind of commander it would require. Speed, aggression, willingness to act without waiting for perfect clarity. Patton fit that profile better than anyone, which made the memory of Sicily both dangerous and instructive. Even the same man who had lost control in a hospital tent might be the one needed to break open an entire front. The question was no longer whether Patton had crossed a line. The question was whether he had learned where it was. The answer would come not in Sicily or Italy or even in apology, but on a far larger stage, where restraint and aggression would need to coexist under conditions far more demanding than anything a hospital tent had revealed. Early 1944 forced Allied leadership to confront a reality they could no longer postpone. The invasion of France was coming, and once the beachhead was secured, the campaign would hinge on exploitation rather than landing craft. Breaking out would require speed, nerve, and a commander willing to move before the enemy could recover. That requirement narrowed the field quickly. Plenty of officers could hold ground. Fewer could take it. Almost none had demonstrated the ability to turn disorder into momentum at scale. Whatever doubts lingered from Sicily, the name that kept resurfacing was George S. Patton. His return was not a pardon. Allied leadership did not forget the hospital incidents, and they did not excuse them. What changed was the balance of risk. Leaving Patton sidelined carried its own danger. The danger of missing a moment when hesitation would cost more lives than any scandal ever could. The solution was conditional restoration. Patton would return to command, but not without limits. He was given a new army, the Third. Built almost from scratch, and with it came expectations that were never written down but clearly understood. Aggression was required. Loss of control was not. Speed would be encouraged. Public incidents would not be tolerated. The margin for error was gone. This was a different kind of trust. Patton was not being forgiven. He was being watched. Every move, every order, every interaction was subject to scrutiny. The general who once believed results excused everything now understood that results had to arrive without creating new problems. That awareness changed how he operated. Patton remained intense, demanding and relentless, but his public behavior sharpened into something more controlled. Inspections became precise rather than theatrical. Discipline was enforced through systems rather than spectacle. Anger, when it appeared, stayed inside command channels instead of spilling into public spaces. The irony was difficult to miss. The man nearly removed for losing control was now expected to command one of the fastest, most autonomous armies of the war. That tension shaped everything about the Third Army's preparation. Officers were selected for initiative and judgment, not just aggression. Logistics were planned with movement in mind. Command relationships emphasized intent over micromanagement. Patton was building an army designed to move without him hovering over it. This mattered because it reduced the risk that his personal temperament would spill into moments where restraint was required. Control shifted from personality to structure. The army could move fast, even when the commander was not physically present. Allied leadership noticed. Reports from training and exercises showed an organization that was aggressive without being chaotic, disciplined without being rigid. Patton had not softened. He had focused. The slapping incident had not changed what he believed about war, but it had changed how he expressed authority. When the invasion of France finally came, Patton was not unleashed immediately. He remained part of the deception effort, visible enough to convince German intelligence that he would lead the main blow, yet absent from the initial landings. This delay served two purposes. It protected the invasion from premature exploitation, and it gave Patton one last reminder that control rested above him. Then came the moment. Once the Normandy front stalled and the need for exploitation became urgent, Patton was activated. The Third Army entered the war not as an experiment, but as a calculated risk. The general, who had nearly ended his career in Sicily, was now entrusted with the most fluid, dangerous phase of the campaign. What followed in France was not an accident. Patton moved fast, but he did not repeat the mistakes of Sicily. He demanded endurance without public humiliation. He enforced discipline without spectacle. Pressure was applied relentlessly, but within boundaries that kept Allied leadership on his side. The slapping incident did not disappear from memory. Oh, it hovered in the background of every decision, a reminder of how close Patton had come to irrelevance. That memory did not weaken him. It sharpened him. He understood now that speed without control could end a career, while speed with discipline could end a war. This balance defined his final form as a commander. The Patton who broke France was not the Patton of the hospital tents. He was more dangerous precisely because he had learned where the lines were and how to operate right up against them without crossing again. The incident that nearly ended everything did not vanish. It became a constraint, and that constraint shaped one of the most effective field commands of the war. The slapping incident did not fade into the background once Patton returned to command. It stayed with him, shaping decisions in ways that were subtle but decisive. The general who led the Third Army across France was not the same man who had walked into hospital tents in Sicily convinced that fear alone explained collapse. The change was not philosophical, it was practical. By the summer of 1944, Patton understood that control mattered as much as speed, not in theory, but in consequence. The cost of losing it had already been paid. When the Third Army began moving, it did so under a command culture designed to absorb stress without turning it into spectacle. This mattered immediately. The advance across France placed enormous strain on units and individuals. Days blurred together. Sleep disappeared. And decisions had to be made faster than information could keep up. Soldiers reached physical and mental limits just as they had in Sicily, but Patton no longer confronted those limits personally or publicly. The system handled them instead. Medical evacuation worked quietly. Combat exhaustion did not vanish from the battlefield, but it was processed through clearer channels. Officers were instructed to rely on medical authority rather than personal judgment. Removal from the line was no longer treated as moral failure, but as a temporary necessity to preserve fighting strength. This shift did not make the army softer. It made it more durable. Patton enforced discipline differently. Pressure still existed, and expectations remained high, yet enforcement moved down through command structures rather than erupting at the top. Battalion and regimental commanders carried the burden of discipline, allowing Patton to focus on tempo, direction, and exploitation. The general set the pace, but he no longer tried to regulate individual endurance face to face. The result was a force that moved faster under less visible friction. This was not kindness. It was efficiency. The Third Army functioned because stress was managed rather than denied. Units broke down less often, not because conditions were easier, but because collapse was anticipated and contained before it spread. Allied leadership noticed the difference. The fear that Patton might implode under pressure did not materialize. Reports from France focused on movement, initiative, and results, not incidents. Or the man once considered too dangerous to control was now operating at the edge of acceptable risk without crossing it. The irony was unavoidable. The incident that nearly ended Patton's career forced him to accept limits he would never have acknowledged voluntarily. Those limits did not restrain his effectiveness. They concentrated it. By removing public volatility from his command style, Patton became harder to oppose, not easier. Germany felt the effect without understanding the cause. The Third Army did not pause to accommodate exhaustion, yet it did not fracture under it either. Momentum held because pressure was distributed across a system rather than absorbed by individuals until they failed. This allowed Patton to keep moving when other armies slowed, not because his men were stronger, but because the system protected them just enough to sustain pace. This connection is easy to miss. Patton's speed in France is often attributed to temperament, aggression, or brilliance. In reality, it depended on restraint learned the hard way. The discipline that saved his career also made his army more resilient under extreme conditions. The slapping incident forced Allied command to define boundaries. Those boundaries did not weaken Patton. They removed a flaw that could have destroyed everything he later accomplished. The general who broke the German front in 1944 did so because he no longer tried to enforce endurance with his own hands. That change altered outcomes. Without it, Patton might have burned out his command, alienated medical staff, or triggered another crisis at the worst possible moment. With it, he became the commander Allied leadership could trust to exploit collapse without creating one of his own. The war did not change because Patton became gentler. It changed because he became more controlled. The hospital tents of Sicily never appeared again in his career, not because stress vanished, but because he learned that pressure applied through structure lasts longer than pressure applied through force. That lesson shaped every mile the Third Army advanced. The incident that almost ended Patton's command did not just survive as a warning. It became a correction. And that correction, quietly applied, helped turn speed into dominance on a scale Sicily could never have imagined. The slapping incidents did not end when Patton returned to command. They waited. For months, what happened in Sicily remained largely contained within military channels, handled through private discipline and quiet reassignment. That silence did not last. By late 1943, details began reaching journalists, and once they did, control over the narrative slipped beyond the Army's reach. When the story broke publicly, it landed hard. Newspapers in the United States described a celebrated general striking soldiers inside field hospitals, men already broken by combat and placed under medical care. The context of Sicily, the exhaustion, the uncertainty around combat fatigue, none of that traveled cleanly across the Atlantic. What readers saw was a simple image: power turned inward against the very soldiers it was meant to lead. The public reaction was immediate and divided. Some readers condemned the behavior outright, viewing it as abuse incompatible with democratic values and the idea of a citizen army. Others defended Patton, arguing that war demanded harsh discipline and that modern society underestimated the pressures faced by frontline commanders. Letters poured into newspapers, radio discussions flared, and the issue spilled beyond military circles into politics. Congress took notice. Lawmakers questioned whether Patton should be allowed to remain in uniform, let alone command an army. Hearings were discussed, though never formally convened. The Army faced a familiar wartime dilemma: enforce standards publicly and risk undermining morale, or contain the issue and preserve operational effectiveness. Senior leaders chose containment again. They did not deny what happened, but they framed it as an isolated failure already addressed through internal discipline. Patton's apologies were emphasized. His removal from frontline command was cited as proof that consequences had been imposed. The Army argued that the matter had been handled appropriately and should not be allowed to damage the war effort. This response reflected more than loyalty to one man. The U.S. Army in 1943 was still expanding, still learning, and still fragile in public confidence. A public court-martial of a senior general risked feeding enemy propaganda and shaking trust at home. Leaders believed that punishing Patton again, publicly, would cost more than it gained. Patton himself stayed silent. He did not give interviews. He did not defend himself in public. Letters from the period show frustration and bitterness, but also resignation. He understood that speaking would only make things worse. The same man who believed pressure solved problems now had to endure it without response. The timing mattered. By the time the story reached its peak, Patton was already back in uniform and preparing for a role in the coming invasion of France. Even if that role remained deliberately ambiguous, removing him at that stage would have disrupted plans far beyond his own career. Gradually, attention shifted. The war moved on, headlines filled with new battles, and the controversy receded without formal resolution. Patton survived politically, not because the incident was forgotten, but because it was overtaken by events that demanded results more than moral clarity. This survival carried a cost. The slapping incidents became a permanent part of Patton's record, a flaw that followed every later achievement. Success in France did not erase Sicily, it merely reframed it. The general who broke the German front would always carry the memory of the moment he lost control. For the Army, the episode left a quieter mark. It forced leaders to confront how much behavior could be tolerated in the name of effectiveness and where the line actually lay. No regulation emerged with Patton's name attached to it, but expectations changed. Commanders became more cautious. Medical authority gained firmer footing. The institution adjusted, as it often does, without announcing the lesson aloud. Patton emerged from the reckoning intact, but constrained. He was no longer untouchable. He was no longer indulged. His future depended entirely on performance without incident. That pressure stayed with him until the end of the war, shaping decisions that outsiders rarely noticed. The slapping incident had moved beyond Sicily. It had become a public test of how a democratic army managed its most dangerous commanders, not by destroying them, but by deciding how much risk it was willing to tolerate. One final question remained. Did the incident represent a momentary failure by an otherwise effective commander, or did it reveal something essential about Patton's approach to war that no amount of success could fully correct? That question is where the story ends. The slapping incident has survived in history because it refuses to fit neatly into either condemnation or excuse. It was not an accident, and it was not a misunderstanding. It was a real failure, carried out by a senior commander, in full view of witnesses, against soldiers who were no longer capable of defending themselves. That fact does not change with context. What context does change is meaning. The incident revealed a fault line that ran through the U.S. Army in 1943, one that had not yet been resolved by doctrine, experience, or understanding. Combat exhaustion existed in large numbers by that stage of the war, but it had not yet been fully accepted as an injury rather than a moral weakness. Commanders were forced to make judgments without the benefit of clarity, and some, like George S. Patton, he made those judgments through older ideas about discipline and endurance. Patton's failure was not ignorance alone. It was certainty. He believed so strongly in the power of discipline to hold armies together that he could not accept collapse without a visible wound. That belief had produced results in broken units before. In Sicily, it collided with something it could not fix. The slap was the moment where conviction replaced judgment. The Army's response mattered just as much as the act itself. Patton was not protected because he was famous, and he was not punished because he was controversial. He was managed because the institution recognized two things at once. The behavior could not be repeated, and the commander could not be discarded lightly. That balance shaped the rest of the war. The slapping incident forced limits into place. Those limits did not exist clearly before Sicily. Afterward, they did. Medical authority gained weight. Psychological injury gained legitimacy. Commanders were reminded that discipline imposed without restraint could destroy trust faster than it created order. None of this happened instantly, and none of it was announced publicly, but it happened. Patton absorbed that lesson in his own way. He did not become gentler, and he did not abandon his belief in pressure. What changed was how pressure was applied. The Patton of France drove his army hard, sometimes brutally, but he no longer tried to enforce endurance with personal confrontation. Systems replaced spectacle. Structure replaced impulse. That change mattered. Without it, and Patton might have broken his own command under the strain of 1944. The advance across France demanded relentless movement under exhaustion that rivaled anything Sicily had produced. The difference was that collapse, when it occurred, was handled quietly and professionally rather than publicly and violently. The Army kept moving because it could absorb stress without turning inward. This is why the incident still matters. It was not just a personal failure. It was a moment where an institution learned where one of its most dangerous strengths became a liability. The lesson was not that discipline was wrong. It was that discipline without control could destroy the very force it was meant to preserve. Patton's later success does not erase Sicily, it explains it. The general who broke the German army in France did so after learning where the line was and what crossing it cost. The army that followed him did so with clearer rules about how far pressure could go before it became self-destructive. History often prefers simple verdicts. Patton was neither redeemed by speed nor damned by a slap. He was corrected. The correction did not soften him. It focused him. That focus shaped one of the most effective field commands of the war. The slapping incident nearly ended Patton's career. Instead, it exposed a flaw early enough to be contained, corrected, and absorbed before the war demanded everything he had to give. That outcome was not inevitable. It was the result of restraint imposed from above and accepted, grudgingly, by a man who had never believed restraint was his role. In the end, the incident stands as a reminder. War does not only test courage and skill, it tests control. When control fails, even briefly, the consequences reach far beyond the moment itself. Patton learned that lesson in a hospital tent in Sicily. The war learned it with him.